We are very privileged this morning to have as our guest speaker Dale McGowan, who left a 15 career as a college professor to pursue full-time writing. He edited and co-authored Parenting Beyond Belief and Raising Free Thinkers, the first comprehensive resources for non-religious parents. He writes for the secular parenting blog, The Mimming of Life, teaches non-religious parenting seminars across the country, and serves as the executive director of Foundation Beyond Belief, a humanist charitable foundation based in Atlanta. In September of 2008, he was named Harvard Humanist of the Year. He holds degrees in physical anthropology and music theory from University of California at Berkeley, as well as a PhD in music composition and theory from the University of Minnesota. He and his wife, Becca, a first-grade teacher, live near Atlanta with their 3 kids, Delaney, Connor, and Aaron. Dale is currently writing Atheism for Dummies, the first book about non-theists in the Dummies series of books. As I mentioned earlier this afternoon, after the service beginning at 1:30, he will lead a parenting workshop. His sermon title is Humor, the Secret Weapon of the Progressive. And we are honored to have him come speak to this group of dummies. Welcome, Dale.
Well, hello, everybody. As you can tell from the title of my talk, there may be a political opinion or two in this talk, and I want to make it clear that any opinions expressed are mine alone. They do not reflect the opinions of the UUA or this congregation or Major League Baseball. I am a progressive liberal. Those are my politics. So you won't be surprised to learn that I'm not a fan of Michelle Bachmann, for example. And I had the honor of living in Minnesota during her climb. So I got to see her at the state level for quite a long time before I got to enjoy her on the national stage. Not a fan. But if I go further than that and suggest that she's a witch, now, not a Wiccan, but a magical, supernatural, demon-possessed agent of Satan, okay? I got applause. If I were to say that, you would think I was kidding. You clearly assume that I'm kidding, because in the last 400 years or so, there's been a noticeable decline in the belief in supernatural witches. But there was a time when that actually could have been taken quite seriously. In the 17th century, here in the colonies, but also in England, witchcraft accusations were quite a big thing. They actually had, at that point, they had been for 300 years. There were a lot of executions, trials, and so on. The accusations reached a fever pitch in the 1650s when the Puritans took over Cromwell and so on, and there were an especially large number of executions during that time, people who were hung or burned or pressed to death as witches. But by the 1660s, the very next decade, the executions stopped completely. Just stopped. And it wasn't because a law had been enacted. Eventually there were laws against this, but at that point it was really a matter of cultural will. They had lost the cultural will to do this. And we'd like to think, the question is, why the sudden abandonment of this thing that had been nearly universal and unquestioned in England for 300 years prior to that? And we'd like to think that it's a matter of reason, right? They looked at it and they said, well, this doesn't make sense, right? We don't actually change on that basis all that often. It did play a role, but the historian William Leckey suggested that a very important part of the change was laughter. When Cromwell died, all of the dour Puritan ideologies quickly fell out of favor, and overnight, the sanctimonious Puritans became the objects of ridicule. Every pub seemed to have a resident funny man who could get all the other patrons rolling on the floor with his impersonation of the sort of nasal speech of the Puritans and the rump-in-the-air gait. And by its close association with Puritanism, witch-burning quickly went from obvious social necessity to ridiculous folly. And it wasn't laughter alone that did this, of course, but laughter played this important role in accelerating the change by puncturing the balloon of sacredness around the practice. Once it became laughable, it couldn't be taken seriously. It couldn't be feared. It was over. Now, something similar happened in Serbia in the 1990s. I could actually run a whole lot of these examples, but this is another good one. Slobodan Milosevic was in power, and resistance had begun to increase against the Milosevic regime, but there was still this tremendous fear, this sort of paralyzing fear around the apparent omnipotence of Milosevic. And then a youth movement called Otpor, which means resistance, was created with the purpose of running Milosevic out of office. They used protest and persuasion to build a core of 70,000 supporters, but they also intentionally and frequently used humor as an essential element of their strategy, ridiculing Milosevic and his government in public street theater performances. Their stated purpose was to puncture the aura of invulnerability around him. And many historians credit Otpor, including their use of humor, with creating the environment that eventually led to the ouster of Milosevic. Now, despite examples like these that I could go on and on with, we tend to dismiss the power of humor. Half the time we say it's just entertainment, right? And the other half of the time we're kind of uncomfortable with it, worried that it would be disrespectful or rude to inject humor and even ridicule into these situations. But Mark Twain had something to say about this in The Mysterious Stranger, which I believe was the last full-length book that he wrote. Wonderful passage delivered by a character named Little Satan. It's not Satan, it's actually his son, who is criticizing the human race. He says, the human race, in its poverty, has unquestionably just one really effective weapon: laughter. Power, money, persuasion, supplication, persecution, all of these can lift at a colossal humbug, push it a little, weaken it a little, century by century. But only laughter can blow it to rags and atoms at a blast. Against the assault of laughter, nothing can stand. You are always fussing and fighting with your other weapons. Do you ever use that one? No. You leave it rusting. As a race, do you ever use it at all? No. You lack the sense and the courage. There's this great symbiosis between reason and social progress and humor all through history. There's evidence of thinkers laughing and laughers thinking, and them coming together to pull us up out of the swamp of ignorance and injustice. If you think about it, humor rarely serves a conservative purpose. It's no coincidence that the comedian who consistently tops the list of favorite conservative comedians, if you see these polls, is Stephen Colbert, who is, of course, a liberal pretending to be a conservative and thereby making fun of conservative positions. Conservatism is about conserving. It is vested by definition in traditional structures, in the status quo. Keeping the powerful in power is part of the agenda. And humor is really a kind of nonviolent protest, an effective way for progressives to challenge the power without shedding actual blood. But that's actually why it frustrates its targets so much, right? Nonviolent protest is very, very frustrating to its targets. It's so hard to respond to. So they're reduced, in essence, to calling it inappropriate, to just saying that it's beyond the pale in some way to do this. You can argue with somebody all you want because they can ignore that. But if I laugh at somebody, there's suddenly a flag on the play, right? I've broken the rules in some way. Now, here's an example from my own past. I lived in Minnesota, as I said, 16 years. And I taught critical thinking for most of that time at a Catholic women's college in St. Paul. And over the years, I became frustrated with the disconnect between what we were asked to teach in the classroom and the college's own policies about the open exchange of ideas. You never heard a peep on campus from voices critical of Catholic policies or actions, much less challenges to religious belief itself. As a women's college, it was also a feminist institution. They considered themselves a feminist institution, so they'd read Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Simone de Beauvoir, Gloria Steinem, Katha Pollitt. Those were always included in the freshman seminar courses. But no mention was ever made of the fact that all of those that I just named were atheists or agnostics. And I felt that was dishonest, so I started posting more complete bios of these women on my office door. There's no response from everyone, just a little bigger smiles. So I started posting these fairly timid quotations from non-believers with a note inviting discussion. And then I moved on to more forceful quotes from Twain and Jefferson and Hume and Voltaire. No response. So I graduated to Russell and Freud and Thomas Huxley. Nothing. Thomas Paine, Isaac Asimov, Richard Dawkins. Nothing. I posted a list of 200 famous atheists and humanists, and I created a Humanist of the Week section on my door. I got no response from anyone. No one mentioned it. 18 months in a row of doing this. So finally, after a year and a half, I posted one satire from The Onion, which is, if you're not familiar with this, it's an online satirical news site. The headline of the piece was, "Pope calls for greater understanding between Catholics and the damned." Now, the article itself is a marvel of satire, of these double statements, each time with the Pope very earnestly saying, we really need to reach out to people. Just because they're going to hell doesn't mean that you can't be nice to them. It's really wonderful. But within hours, I had an outraged response from a theologian on campus, a friend of mine, actually. But he said, ridicule has no place in discourse. Now, why did he yawn at serious arguments for a year and a half? I knew that he had seen them for a year and a half because his wife worked in my building. But then he suddenly protested at humor. That's very interesting. Now, first of all, I have to say this wasn't just ridicule. Ridicule is fine. But ridicule is the contemptuous declaration that something's ridiculous. That's what it is. You point and scornfully you say, that's ridiculous. It can express outrage, but this was something much more powerful. This was satire. Satire uses wit to attack the vices and follies of humankind. It doesn't just point and laugh. It has to be based not just in my opinion that something's ridiculous, but in a truth that will be recognized by others. That's when it works. Satire, by definition, has a point to make, a critique to offer. It seeks change, using humor as a medium to reveal the truth. And The Onion does this all the time. There's so many ways in which it draws out contradictions and absurdities. There's one headline I remember. God answers the prayers of a paralyzed little boy. No, says God. And one of my favorites of all time was Sumerians look on in confusion as God creates world. That one takes a minute. If you're like me, you will enjoy that all day long. I keep coming back to that. I said, what? And you can start to see why humor is a natural fit for liberals. It's about changing, reframing, right? Spotting inconsistencies in our assumptions. But it also puts the powerful in a terrible bind. Jokes directed downward in the power continuum are considered in bad taste, right? Ethnic jokes by powerful whites, jokes about the disabled by people who are not, and so on, while jokes directed upward at the powerful can be a means of redressing the imbalance. Now, I threw away a couple of pages of my talk because 3 days ago something wonderful happened that I had to include, the Al Smith dinner in New York, when we had President Obama and Governor Romney telling jokes, and you actually had an illustration of how it can work and how it cannot work in terms of the liberal and conservative thing. And some of the jokes were actually pretty darn good from both of them. Romney's opening joke was one of the best. Standing in a full tuxedo, white tie and tails, he said, "A campaign can require a lot of wardrobe changes. Blue jeans in the morning, maybe, suits for a lunch fundraiser, sport coat for dinner. But it's nice to finally relax and wear what Ann and I wear around the house." And the president also made a couple of jokes about Romney's wealth. He said, "Earlier today I went shopping at some stores in Midtown. But I understand Governor Romney went shopping for some stores in Midtown." Now, both of them were pointing at the power. And in Romney's case, that meant pointing at himself. And that was okay. That made it a very funny joke. But 6 years ago, at the same dinner, George W. Bush violated that rule. Here he is standing in full tux and tails and white tie, and he said, "Well, this is an impressive crowd, the haves and the have-mores." Some people call you the elite. I call you my base. And to a lot of people, the sight and sound of this incredibly wealthy crowd laughing at that line felt like the worst kind of entitled sneering. It was a joke about the wealthy and powerful, but it was at the expense of the have-nots, who clearly weren't in the room. Now, I think the best current example of progressive humor has to be The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. It's been running for 14 years now, shows no signs of slowing down. But in 2007, I don't know how many people remember this, Fox News tried to launch a conservative equivalent called the half-hour news hour. I don't know if anybody saw that go by. It just did not work because it's too hard to make workable comedy out of a defense of the status quo and tradition. It's just too hard. It died a worthy death after about 6 painful months. The Daily Show's targets are power and the status quo. Even when the Democrats are in charge, that's a joke that works. But the half-hour news hour came off as a wincing series of sneers at the powerless. And, of course, it takes more than the right target for the joke to be funny. To understand why, we've got to break comedy up into its parts. There are really 3 things that are often present in a joke: contrast, truth, and what I call the revealed obvious. Humor works best when it deals in these sudden, shocking juxtapositions, this contrast between appearance and reality or between expectation and outcome, right? That's a very important part. Truth, this is very interesting. A joke is often funny in proportion to its ability to reveal something that's true, but hidden by a fig leaf, right? And the laugh comes as the fig leaf is yanked away, and the strength of the laugh is what Lenny Bruce called a Geiger counter for the truth of the joke's premise. And truth is all about perception, of course. It depends on whether the audience thinks it's true, whether it's going to get a laugh or not. The third piece of comedy theory is the really damning one, the one that's hardest on the target. I call that the revealed obvious. If I tell a joke about Michelle Bachmann, I'm not just saying that her actions or beliefs are ridiculous, but I'm counting on the ridiculousness to be so immediately obvious to the audience that it will bring a sudden roar of laughter when I strip that fig leaf away, right? What I'm saying to my target really is not only are you wrong, but your wrongness is so obvious to people that when I point it out, it will bring a spontaneous recognition of truth. That is insulting, right? That's why it works. That's the recipe for The Daily Show's success. Now, one example from The Daily Show, and then I'll wrap up. During the 2008 election, Jon Stewart ran a clip of Karl Rove singing the praises of Sarah Palin. She'd just been named to the McCain ticket, and Rove said, she's a populist, she's an economic and social conservative, she's the former mayor of, I think, the 2nd largest city in Alaska before she ran for governor. It's the 6th largest, but... So the camera comes back to John, and he said, Karl Rove is very impressed with Governor Palin's experience as mayor of a city with 9,000 people in it. Now, I imagine he was equally impressed last month when Tim Kaine, former mayor of Richmond, population 200,000, former lieutenant governor and current governor of Virginia, landed on Barack Obama's vice presidential shortlist. Immediate cut back to Karl Rove, who said, Kaine's been a governor for 3 years. He was mayor of the 105th largest city in America. And again, with all due respect to Richmond, Virginia, it's smaller than Chula Vista, California. It's not a big town. So if Obama were to pick Governor Kaine, it would be an intensely political choice where he said, you know what, I'm not mostly concerned with whether this person's capable of being president of the United States. The camera goes back to Jon Stewart, who is simply sitting there like this. That's all he had to do. The comedy was entirely contained in Karl Rove saying 2 different things on 2 different dates that entirely contradicted him. So Stewart finally, after the audience stops weeping with joy, turns to the camera and says, Karl Rove is apparently deeply divided on the experience issue. Now, I could go straight through history with these examples. Start Erasmus and the Praise of Folly, which was a satire on the Catholic Church that was just 8 years before the Reformation, and a lot of historians think that it laid the groundwork for that change. Thomas Nast bringing down Tammany Hall with his political cartoons. Mark Twain, Dick Gregory, Whoopi Goldberg taking on racism. Kurt Vonnegut and Lenny Bruce going after war. George Carlin going after religion. Gloria Steinem, who is not typically thought of as a comedian, wrote a really terrific piece you should look up if you can, called If Men Could Menstruate. She said, what would happen if suddenly, magically, men could menstruate and women could not? She said, menstruation would become an enviable, boast-worthy masculine event. Men would brag about how long and how much. Sanitary supplies would be federally funded. Military men, right-wing politicians, and religious fundamentalists would cite menstruation, that's menstruation, as proof that only men could serve in the army because you have to give blood to take blood. The churches would say that women can't be priests or rabbis because I love this one, without the monthly loss of impurities, women remain unclean. So this goes way beyond humor that's just for a laugh. This is humor that's reframing our view of the world. It's making us look at the world in a different way. It's incredibly powerful, and it's inherently progressive. Conservatism isn't looking to reframe. It's looking to reinforce the frame that's already there. That's a very, very different position. So when it's done well, humor can open doors. Activist Andrew Boyd said humor is an interactive device. It builds solidarity between the speaker and the audience. People are usually not confrontational when they're part of the process. And humor invites people into the process. It's not just saying, listen to me, you should pay attention to this. It's saying, let's play together. Let's laugh together. It's a very different dynamic. Humor holds the door open that gets everybody into the same room playing together. And once we're in there, once we've played together for a while, we can get down to the business of progress. Thanks very much.